Alrighty. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Tech Day 2020. My name is Ryan Dickey, and I'm part of the ERP team in the Division of IT. My co-moderator is Nini Williams, who is also part of the Division of IT. The title of this session is You're All a Bunch of Phonies, Imposter Syndrome and Information Technology. I also want to begin by mentioning that the session is being recorded. This session is being sponsored by Pearson. Pearson is one of the leading digital courseware publishers used by Cal State Fullerton for the Titan Direct Access program and more. Visit pearson.com to learn more. You may also visit Pearson's virtual vendor booth today between 12:30 p.m. and 1 p.m. At the end of this session, please fill out the prompted survey to be placed in the opportunity drawing to win a $50 Amazon gift card donated by Pearson. During this session, please use the Q&A feature to submit questions. We will answer as many as we can after the presentation. I would also like to introduce our speaker. Tara Hughes is the Interim Assistant Director of Strategic Communications and the Student Success Chatbot at CSU Channel Islands. Everybody give a big welcome to Tara.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. And Ryan, thank you for the introduction. I'm just going to share my screen real quick and we'll get started. And here we go. All right. So I don't know how many of you know who Neil Gaiman is, but he shares a story that I thought would be really helpful in maybe framing our conversation for today. So I'm going to start out with that. Neil Gaiman is an award-winning author. He's written a number of very successful books: Coraline, Stardust, Neverwhere, American Gods. There's a very long list. And he tells this story about how he was invited a number of years ago to this very prestigious event where there were a number of very successful people in their own respective careers who had been in attendance. So there were other authors, there were musicians and scientists and researchers, you name it. And he talks about how he's at this event and feels like at any moment a spotlight is going to shine down on him and he is going to be removed from the premises because he has infiltrated this event that he has no place being at. He just felt so out of place. And he goes on to share about how one evening he's standing towards the back of the room and he strikes up this conversation with an older gentleman who happens to share the same first name as him. And they're chatting, and at some point this older gentleman named Neil turns over and says, you know, I just look around at this room filled with all of these incredibly successful people, and I just think, how in the heck am I here? Why did they invite me? All I did was go where I was sent. And Gaiman's kind of struck by this and looks over at him and says, yeah, but you were the first man to walk on the moon. I think that counts for something. Gaiman goes on to share that that interaction had a profound impact on him because if Neil freaking Armstrong, the first man to walk on the moon, thought that he didn't belong in that space with those people, that his own successes still weren't enough to merit his being at that event, maybe we all struggle with that a little bit, and maybe it's okay for us to talk about it and acknowledge it. So this is imposter syndrome. And, you know, I want to start out by saying there are, or perhaps maybe you're not aware, but I would suggest that there are probably many people at CSU Fullerton and in the CSU at large who are incredible workers and really high performing people. But these are also people who are never going to ask for a raise and never going to ask for a promotion. And considering our current state of budget, maybe some people think that's a good problem to have, but I would argue that that's actually not a good thing. That's actually something that we need to address. Imposter syndrome is a psychological term referring to a pattern of behavior where people doubt their accomplishments and they have this really consistent fear of being exposed as a fake or a fraud. It was initially discovered by two remarkable psychologists in the early 1970s, Dr. Suzanne Imes and Dr. Pauline Rose Clance. And what they found was that people who feel like they're imposters or struggle with imposter syndrome feel as though they don't belong in the spaces that they occupy. And not only that, these are people who tend to be your top performers and your high achievers. They don't see their success as something that they've earned or have come by way of merit, but they actually attribute their success to luck. And just like the slot machine in Vegas, eventually they think their luck is going to run out. And when it does, the consequences will be severe. You know, for some people, that means they might lose their job. For other people, that means that they may lose the respect of their peers or their colleagues, which in some ways might be worse in their mind. Which brings me to knowledge workers. And I want to camp out on this just for a moment because I think it's really critical for our conversation moving forward. So knowledge workers are people whose stock in trade is in what they know. This is really different from other careers and jobs where you put forward your hard work and effort and have a tangible result from the work that you've put forward. Knowledge isn't like that because it's hard to measure, right? So if you're thinking about knowledge and skills compared to something that has that tangible reward at the end of your work. They're not the same thing, right? Because they're opaque. Knowledge is opaque. Whereas if I am doing a job, you know, I was a barista at Starbucks once upon a time. I knew that I had a tangible result towards my effort, making coffee or making a latte, right? But when you're working in a knowledge skilled field, you don't have that same sense of seeing the accomplishment of your hard work. I feel like even this is an opaque kind of discussion. So I think an example might help. Um, my great grandparents immigrated from Spain over to Hawaii to be sugarcane pickers. And I haven't done a lot of research on sugarcane picking, unfortunately, but I'm pretty sure that if I just wanted to see at the end of the day who had been the most successful at picking sugarcane, all I would have to do is see who had the most, right? There's a tangible, quantifiable element for me being able to determine who was successful that day. Whereas knowledge doesn't afford us that same luxury, right? And this is really important when we think about imposter syndrome because people who struggle with imposter syndrome, the way that they view knowledge is extremely important. They see knowledge as something that others have in spades compared to them. They think that the knowledge that others possess absolutely dwarfs the knowledge that they themselves possess. And the reality is that's not true, right? The reality is there is knowledge that I have that you may not have about something. And then there's knowledge that we may both possess, our knowledge overlaps. And then there's knowledge that you have that I don't have, but maybe your colleague does, right? And I think that's what a really good, diverse, blended team looks like. But someone who struggles with imposter syndrome, they don't see it that way. They just see the little bit of knowledge that they have and presume that everyone else has so much more than they do. And it really impacts the way that they see themselves and the way that they see others and the comparisons that they make from those determinations. So what does this have to do with us in information technology? That is a great question. I'm glad you asked it. So information technology, I think, is particularly vulnerable to imposter syndrome. And I would double down on that by saying, I think higher education is as well. So we're in a real pickle because we work in information technology in higher education. So I think this conversation is particularly pertinent for us today. The Blind did a poll of their users, over 10,000 of them, and their users are tech workers, people who work in various tech industries. And they polled their users a few years ago and they asked them, do you struggle with imposter syndrome or do you feel like an imposter? over 50% said yes. And I think this is really staggering statistic because if you look at the organizations that these folks work for, these are some really innovative titans of the industry. And in order to be a leader in the industry and technology, they have to have the best of the best. And yet the best of the best is saying, I'm not sure I'm good enough. I'm not sure I belong. That is remarkable. And I think if that's true just in the general technology space, I think that's probably true for us in technology in higher ed. And really, we're just lacking concentrated research on that to better understand it. But I think there's definitely a correlation there. So why is that? Why is information technology vulnerable? Well, I think one reason is that IT is a fast-paced industry. You know, what you knew 5 or 10 years ago quickly becomes outdated and probably isn't incredibly relevant to everything that you need to know today. And what you're going to need to know in 5 to 10 years ago probably isn't going to be exactly the same for the knowledge that you possess today, right? There's definitely an expiration date to our knowledge and skills because there's just such a rapid turnover. Things are changing so quickly. And because of that, it's hard to keep up with it, let alone become an expert in any particular part of IT because of its rate of change. And then I think within higher education, there is a vulnerability. It certainly is going to change. It is changing. I like to think of higher ed being more like a slow metamorphosis. I think the last 7 months is probably the only, it kind of flies in the face of that. But even when you think about that, that was a change that most of higher ed was forced to grapple with. And a lot of those changes were changes that folks in IT had been trying to introduce and finding a lot of resistance. And so higher ed certainly has change happening, but it is slower. And there's different reasons and limitations for that, right? Sometimes it's budget. Sometimes it's just how established our institutions are with the way that they're doing things. And it's hard to see how change can impact those protocols or processes, but change still is part of higher ed. I think it's also just really tough to gauge whether you're being successful or not in IT. So much of what we do, there's certainly a lot of different variables that can potentially indicate whether we're doing a good job, but not necessarily, right? I could have 100 help desk tickets about a tool. That doesn't necessarily mean that the tool is broken, right? It doesn't mean it's a total failure. Or I could have no help desk tickets, and that doesn't mean that we're doing something right. Sometimes people just don't want to ask for help, right? There's all these other variables that can really impact our ability to assess whether or not we're doing a good job. And they can, unfortunately, lead us to make erroneous conclusions if we're only going by those specific data points. There's a few other points, but just given our time limitation, I just condensed it down to those because I think those are the really critical ones. But I think it's safe to say that imposter syndrome is definitely a thing. It's a thing that affects us in IT and higher ed. And it's not just something that affects me as an individual if I struggle with it, right? It also can have a negative impact on our units and our organizations at large. So one way it can have a negative impact is it can cause people to be risk averse. We talked a little bit about how IT is this quickly changing industry that has a fast pace, which requires us to be innovative. And I think sometimes take leaps in the things that we try. And if you're too afraid of failure to try new things, you're going to be in a real pickle because you're in an industry that is going to quickly leave you behind. So being risk averse is not helpful for us to really be able to find success. It can also cause people to be secretive. You know, if you don't have all of the information, you can't make a determination as to whether or not I'm a fake or whether or not I'm up to snuff, right? And so it's safer, it's a defense mechanism to just kind of keep things to myself, which I think also corresponds with isolating oneself and being less collaborative. If I don't collaborate with you and don't work with you on things, then you don't have the opportunity to make an assessment as to whether or not I'm fit to do the job. And so really, again, it's protecting myself from someone else's judgment that I might not be good enough. So those are definitely bad things. They're bad for us as individuals in pursuing our own success, and it's bad for our organizations. But I think it's not enough to just leave it there. Um, it might seem nice, especially on our budget, to have employees who work super hard and want to succeed. And maybe we might think we can deal with those other negative impacts. But again, I would say that those negative impacts far outweigh whatever perceived benefits we think come with folks who are motivated through their imposter syndrome. But before we go about fixing it, we have to first know how to recognize it. So these next couple slides are in thanks to Valerie Young, and she is a really well-known, reputable author and speaker on imposter syndrome. The first is perfectionism. Folks who struggle with perfectionism set really high expectations for themselves and can really feel like failures if they only achieve even 99% of their goals because they're focusing on that 1% that they didn't achieve. Small mistakes in their minds can really be seen as validation that they're frauds. And I am the first to admit that that is absolutely me. And I've given this presentation several times, and every time I screw up somewhere, and every time I have to really fight myself to not be focusing on the area that I screwed up, but really focus on the things that went well. But that's really hard for me as a perfectionist. It can also cause people to, what I should say, people who might be more prone to imposter syndrome are what Valerie has identified as Superman or Superwoman. So these are people who really are trying to prove to themselves, and I think to other people, but mostly to themselves, that they belong, that they're not imposters. And so they need to be successful in every aspect of their lives, and they're looking to save the day in any which way they possibly can. And then soloists. These are folks who really think that unless they can achieve something on their own, they must be a fake. If I need to have help from other people, then that must be confirmation that I'm an imposter, because if I was good enough, I could do it by myself. There's a few others, and I would happily share those resources with you, but for sake of time, I limited it to those. I would say at this point, it would be a really depressing presentation if I left you with just that. There are some strategies I think that are really helpful in combating imposter syndrome. But before we get to those, just a quick disclaimer, I'm not a doctor. I have done research on this and really spent my time on discovering these things. And these are some strategies that I myself use. But really hopefully this presentation is a good conversation starter. So if there's anything that really kind of pricks at you, I really encourage you talk to somebody. So with that being said, the first one is don't compare yourself. We talked a little bit about knowledge and how knowledge is not quantifiable, and it's really hard for us to measure it and thus make accurate determinations from it. And I think that's true with the comparison factor, right? So let me give a little bit of an example to flesh this out a little bit. This is obviously slightly old because Cam Newton is no longer on this team, but that's okay. A couple seasons ago, Cam Newton, a quarterback in the NFL, averaged 40 rushing yards per game, which is a really great statistic for a quarterback. Meanwhile, our mystery quarterback only averaged 3.5 rushing yards per game, which is pathetic. And if we're going to compare these quarterbacks on this data point, I think it's really easy to say Cam Newton is the superior quarterback. until we see that our mystery quarterback is Tom Brady. Tom Brady is, I think, a polarizing figure, unfortunately. Not everyone was a Patriots fan, but he is a 6-time Super Bowl winner. He's a 4-time Super Bowl MVP and a 3-time NFL MVP. And regardless of your feelings for him as a quarterback or the teams that he's played for, it's undeniable that he is successful at what he does. And so I think that this illustration is really good at showing us that when we only zero in on one data point, it can lead us to making a really erroneous conclusion. So don't compare yourself, because often we don't have all of the important data points to make an accurate decision or determination about something or ourselves. Reframe your thoughts. You know, so often it's really easy to kind of let our thoughts hold sway over us more than they should. And I think that that is certainly true for myself. But when I reframe my thoughts and I realize that things are not as negative as I might perceive them to be, um, I have to really change what's going on in my mind and the way that I'm thinking about those things before anything else is going to change. There's been research that has shown that the only difference between someone who experiences imposter syndrome and someone who doesn't is how they respond to challenges. The person who struggles with imposter syndrome sees a challenge as an example for failure, that this is going to be their opportunity to show people that they're the worst. As opposed to someone who doesn't struggle with that, sees challenges as opportunities. Whether they're successful or not, those are opportunities to grow and to learn. And that's a really important distinction, but it starts with our mind and our thoughts and the way that we think about things. And so I would really suggest that reframing your thoughts and the way that you think about things is incredibly important. Acknowledge your successes. Um, as a perfectionist, this is really, really hard for me. And it's really important for me to stop and intentionally think about what have I done well, even when I make a mistake. If I didn't get to a slide the way that I wanted to, or I didn't make the point I wanted to make, or I missed a deadline, um, I have to stop and remind myself of what I did do well, and not minimize those successes, no matter how big or little they might be. And the other part of that is that if I'm not taking the time to think about and reflect on and acknowledge my own successes, as a leader, there's a good possibility that I'm probably not taking the time to acknowledge the successes of my team. And that's really hurtful for them as well. I think we all need support and encouragement and the recognition when we're doing something well. So take the time to acknowledge your success, even if that means just writing down a list of 5 things that you did well at the end of the day. Celebrate those. Find a mentor. You know, I think this is going to be my soapbox forever. But I just cannot stress how much a mentor can help, for a lot of different reasons. For me, I've had mentors who are just such a wonderful source of encouragement and support, but also provide accountability and help me with reframing my thoughts. But I would also suggest that you pay it forward. Don't just find a mentor, be a mentor. Be a lifelong learner. So remember the enthusiasm and curiosity that you had when you were in school, and the idea of you didn't have to know everything in order to find enjoyment in learning. I think as we move on in our careers, we can lose that enthusiasm, and instead, when we don't know something, take it as an indictment of our skills and ability, like somehow that's a reflection of who we are. Face your fear. Um, Feel the fear and do it anyways. Every time I have to do a presentation, there's always a little bit of fear that I have. And I would just encourage you that it's worth doing. It's worth doing things that are a little bit scary. You learn something about yourself, and you certainly learn something about others, in being able to connect with people. It gives you the ability to be empathetic. And you'd miss out on a lot of life if you let your fears dictate what you do and don't do. And lastly, keep going. Just persevering is so important, and you don't always realize who you may be inspiring by your perseverance. And my encouragement would be that some very good advice was shared to me recently, which is just half the battle is just showing up, just show up. And that certainly ties with facing your fear, right? But keep going, it is worth it. And then this is just a quote that I return to often, especially when I'm really struggling with my own imposter thoughts. It's from Winston Churchill. Success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts. That is it. Ryan, I hope I met my timeline.
Yes, you did. You're perfect, Tara. I think we have a couple
Yay.
questions that Nini will go through.
Yes, we do. First question we have is from anonymous attendee. Find a mentor sounds easier said than done. How do you find one?
That's a great question. You know, I would say for me personally, Educause has been really helpful in giving me some guidance in terms of just connecting me with people. When I went to their management institute a couple years ago, there were some faculty that that were just really inspiring to me, but I had to take the step forward and say, hey, would you be willing to meet a few times, you know, and just be that kind of shepherd or mentor to help guide me through my career because I have questions. So I do think that there is an element of you've got to ask. And that's where networking is super important. But even at conferences like this, right? If there is a speaker that you really admire, or there's something that resonates with you, I would really encourage you to have the courage to reach out. I know, at least for me, it's super scary to reach out, but I've had people reach out to me, and it's such an honor for someone to come forward and say, hey, I really like what you said about that. Would you be willing to meet with me and discuss what this looks like and how this impacts my career? But you know, look for the opportunities. They are there, even if it's just someone from another institution. I think mentors are pretty much everywhere. You just have to keep your eyes open for those possibilities and be willing to ask. And I would be happy to connect you with people too, if someone had any questions for recommendations.
Perfect. Okay, we're moving on to the next question from Andre Deloach. What books would you recommend on this topic, being the topic that you just discussed?
Yeah, so Valerie Young's is really good. And she has a blog too. So even I would just encourage you to check out her website. You know, I don't have specific imposter syndrome books that I've recommended, but I would say any of Brene Brown's works have been really helpful to me. The one that was probably, I don't know that it really addressed imposter syndrome, but as I was working through this presentation, creating it, I was reading her book, Braving the Wilderness. And it really talked so much about having courage and being true to yourself and being authentic. And that was so helpful. Michelle Obama's book, Becoming, talks a little bit about her struggles with imposter syndrome. So even works that aren't specifically dedicated to imposter syndrome, there's still some really good stuff out there.
Great. Okay, and we have another question, anonymous attendee. How does engaging in group activities, discussions across different groups help with imposter syndrome?
Well, I think that it is always beneficial to be exposed to diversity of thought, right? So if you're working with groups of people outside of your sphere, chances are you're going to be introduced to a different perspective, which is really helpful. I think it has the benefit, but it's also challenging to work with people that maybe have a different way of looking at things, because sometimes that can really trigger those imposter feelings. There's this sense of feeling like I have to be the expert, and if they ask me a question that I don't have an answer to, that can make me feel as though, oh, see, now I'm an imposter. So I think that, working in groups can be really good, but being aware that there's certainly the potential, if you're not looking out for it, to also um, struggle with feeling like an imposter if you're setting these expectations up for yourself. But I do think that working with people who have a different perspective than you, a different background than you, that's going to help stretch your thinking and help you grow. And that's going to help you, I think, be able to relate to other people and realize that they're people too. And they're not perfect at everything, and that's okay. And hopefully you can relate to one another better.
All right, Tara, I just want to say thank you so much again for joining us today. It was a great presentation. We do have those questions put in, and we'll send you over any left over. But wanted to say thanks again. And as a reminder to everybody to please fill out the survey at the end of this webinar. Once I click end, you'll be automatically redirected. Fill it out. We welcome any comments or questions, and we hope to see you at the next one. So thanks again, Tara.
Thank you.